Hello, I'm Jordan, and this is Andalusia Knits, my YouTube channel where I talk about all things knitting. And today I have a tip video for y'all all about knitting blankets. Now, this is a kind of project that a lot of people are intimidated by because of the size and the scope of a blanket. But I think if you know the right questions to ask and you know the kind of project that you're setting out to make, knitting a blanket doesn't have to be any more convoluted or any more stressful than any other sort of knitting. So in this video, I'm going to walk you through those tips and those questions, and I'm going to show you how making different decisions at different points in the process can lead to different outcomes. And hopefully by the end of this, you will have all the information you need to knit a blanket that is perfect for you and your intended purposes. Now, these tips are meant to be useful for any sort of blanket project you're doing, any sort of pattern that you've already picked out. These should come in handy. But throughout the course of the video, I'm going to show you a blanket design that I am currently in the process of working on, and I'll throw up a picture of it right here. And if this looks like a kind of blanket that is interesting to you, I would encourage you to subscribe to the channel because I am currently in the process of getting this pattern released. And if you're interested in making it, subscribing is the best way to know when it finally launches. But I think that's going to do it for an intro, so let's get to the blanket knitting. So before we get to the tips, the first thing to do in this process is just to start thinking a little bit about who this project is going to be for and what sort of purpose the blanket is going to serve. Because those two questions, the answers to those two questions is going to influence the choices you make in terms of the yarn choice and the blanket construction. And at this point in the process, you don't have to have everything nailed down because after I go through the tips, I will talk a little bit about some ideas for how you can help rank these priorities in your own project. But it's just good to have this in the back of mind the entire time that you are knitting and brainstorming ideas for this blanket, because like I said, the answers to these questions of who's the blanket for and what's the blanket going to be used for is going to change some of the decisions that you make. So for example, if I want to make a blanket for myself and I want it to be a fancy heirloom decorative blanket, I'm going to make different choices about that construction and about that yarn than if I am knitting a baby blanket that's going to be used every day by a tired, overworked parent. The different answers to those questions are going to lead me to make different choices. So it's good to have that in your mind as you're going through this entire process of knitting a blanket. And as we go through these tips specifically, I'm going to be bringing this idea up again and again of who's it for and what's the purpose. Is it a decorative fancy blanket versus an everyday use blanket? Is this for someone who knows and cares a lot about different fiber makeups of yarn? Or is this for someone who maybe doesn't know all of the ins and outs about the different fiber types in yarn? Those are questions just to keep in mind as we go through this entire process. The first tip I want to discuss is some advice around fiber choice for your blanket. And this is important for a couple reasons. One is that washing a blanket is typically a bit more of an ordeal than washing other kinds of knitwear because it's so big. And so the machine washable versus hand washable debate is a lot more intense in this arena. And also because a blanket may or may not be a knitted object that you're going to spend a lot of time cuddled up underneath. And if it's knit in a fiber that you don't like the feel of, that is going to be a problem for your blanket. And this is a great place to start because this is a decision that you can make at any point in the planning process. So even if you already have a blanket pattern picked out at this point, yarn choice, fiber choice is still a decision you can make that can help move your blanket in the correct direction. So the first thing to discuss, I think, is probably the washability. So obviously a machine washable blanket is going to be less of a hassle than a hand wash only blanket, but there might be some scenarios where hand washing is preferable to you. And that is for blankets that are perhaps more decorative than they are functional. So if you have a blanket that is meant to be, draped over the back of a chair or something, it's meant to look pretty, it's meant to look beautiful, but it's not necessarily meant for you to cuddle up and get cozy in on a regular basis. then maybe a non-machine washable yarn is fine because it looks fancier, it looks more luxe, and since you're not actually having to wash this thing very often because it's not getting a lot of heavy use, perhaps the machine washable yarn is not an issue for you. But on the other hand, like let's say once again, this is going to be the example that I come back to over and over again in this video. Let's say you're knitting a baby blanket for a first-time exhausted parent. Like obviously go for the machine washable because they are not going to have the time or the patience or the brain power or the hours in the day to like get down and like hand wash a baby blanket that is getting soiled on a regular basis. But it is worth considering that like ease of use is not always going to be the most important thing. Like I said, a machine washable yarn, an acrylic yarn, for example, is going to be easier to care for. But once again, I don't think it's wise to completely ignore the issue of comfort because like I said, if this is a blanket that you are going to be spending a lot of time cuddled up underneath, then it might be worth going for a more finicky fiber to care for if that is the fiber that you feel more comfortable in, that's the fiber that feels cozier to you. So I've got a couple real life blanket examples here with me. That are knit out of different fibers, and I will talk you through like why I chose the fibers I did, just to sort of show you what I'm talking about for this tip. And so this first blanket I have here, and I don't think I'm going to be able to get any of these completely in frame, and so I will try my best to remember to put up some full-size images of these. But this is a blanket that I finished recently, and this doesn't have an intended recipient. This is actually a knitting pattern that I'm working on. So this blanket is meant not so much to be like a cuddle up on the couch blanket as a decorative sort of like throw blanket or like a layout on the floor blanket. So this is a blanket that's meant to look pretty more so than like actually provide warmth. And so for this particular project, I went with a low pill acrylic yarn. And so there are a couple reasons that I went with this specific fiber mix. And the first one is that acrylics, synthetics in general, are going to be more affordable than animal fibers or plant fibers generally. And so I knew that this wasn't going to be a like cuddle up blanket for me, and I would prefer to use animal fibers for blankets that I'm actually going to be like using as an everyday blanket. So I went with the acrylic because it was a more affordable option, and I knew that like the texture, the feel was not going to be an issue because I was not actually going to be like under this for a substantial amount of time. But then I also went with the low pill option specifically just so that the yarn will look a little bit nicer for longer. Now, low pill doesn't mean no pill, but this should hold up and not get fuzz balls a lot better than a no pill, whatever, a regular acrylic yarn, I suppose is the word for it. So I went with the affordable synthetic option with this because this is meant to look nice, but it's not necessarily meant to feel cozy. And so the other blanket I have with me, and this is another one I'm definitely not going to be able to get fully into frame, but this is a checkerboard blanket that I knit a few years ago. And as you can see, it looks a little bit worse for wear than the other one. There's absolutely some pills on this, and that is because this is a all wool blanket. And so I went all wool for this version. Like I already mentioned a little bit, when it comes to things that I want to cozy up underneath. Personally, I would prefer a wool or an animal fiber like this. And while that does mean that it's a little bit more of a pain to deal with, this is a blanket I have to hand wash. It's not too terribly bad because I love using it, and because wool is not getting as dirty. It doesn't need to be washed as frequently as some other fibers. So while it is a pain to wash, I'm maybe not having to wash it as frequently as if this was made out of acrylic or cotton or some other sort of fiber. It looks a little worse for wear. It's definitely got some pills on it, but once again, that's fine because my purpose for this was not for it to look pretty. This is not something that I'm displaying and bragging about. This is something that I'm actively using and sleeping underneath and that sort of thing. And so yeah, it's like, once again, I just wanted to show that it's all about like what your particular priorities are for a project. So, there's nothing wrong with this first blanket I showed, and there's nothing wrong with this blanket I showed. They're just serving two different purposes, and so my choices in terms of yarn fiber really diverged and really took two wildly different paths for that. So yeah, that's going to do it for the fiber choice section. Once again, just like as always in this video, be asking yourself, who is this for and what's it going to be used for? And in relation to fiber choice, those questions have to do with like, how much do I like the feel of this fiber and how easy is it to care for this fiber? So this next tip, unlike the first one, which was more about what is the finished object going to look like, what's it going to feel like, how it's going to behave, this next tip is more about what is the knitting experience like for you as the knitter. And so I want to take some time to talk about advice in terms of your yarn weight, how big your yarn is, because there are, once again, some trade-offs to consider. And these have more to do with how much time you have to knit this project and what the final dimensions of this project are going to be. And so the trade-off for this one is pretty obvious. If you use a lighter weight yarn, the finished object is going to weigh less, but it's going to take you more time to knit. And if you use a heavier yarn, the finished object is going to weigh more, but it's going to take you less time to knit. And there's nothing objectively inherently better or worse about either one of those scenarios. Once again, it's just a matter of what your goals for the project are and what your limitations for the project are. So this is a scenario where I am definitely going to be thinking about how big the finished dimensions of my blanket are. Because it's one thing for me to knit like a baby blanket sized project in fingering weight yarn, but it's completely another thing to like knit a blanket the size of a California King mattress in lace weight yarn. Like there are just some pragmatic, practical realities about the size of this project that are really going to make me stop and consider the yarn weight I'm using. And so if this is a blanket for me and there's no timeline, I probably am going to go with a finer weight yarn because I want the finished object to be a little bit lighter and feel a little bit more luxurious. But if this is a gift knit and I have a month before I have to deliver this gift, obviously that is going to impact my yarn choice on a practical level, and I'm going to go maybe with a worsted or a chunky sized yarn instead. And so once again, there's no right or wrong answer in this section. This is absolutely a place where you need to get like ruthlessly practical and pragmatic with yourself, especially if this is a gift knit with a deadline attached to it. But beyond that, once again, it's a matter of considering the general questions that we've been asking this entire time. Who's this for and what's it going to be used for? So once again, if this is not a blanket that you're going to be cuddled up underneath, maybe a heavier yarn is fine. Maybe the extra bulk is fine because it's not going to be weighing you down. Or maybe you want a heavier blanket and so you want to go with a chunkier yarn than a lighter yarn. So then to just return very quickly to my example blankets again, this everyday personal use blanket I have, it is knit in worsted weight yarn and it is approximately the size of a queen size mattress. And this thing took a while. This thing took me probably over a year to knit. So there was no rush, and because it was going to be used every day, I really wanted something that felt nice and that I would actually want to use. So then compare that with this blanket, which is not itself a gift knit. This was more a knit as the sample for a pattern that I'm designing. But so it doesn't maybe have as much of a deadline as a gift knit. But I wanted to get this done quickly, and sort of this is my MO when it does come to gift knit blankets. I'm knitting approximately this size blanket. And using this modular approach. And so for this, I did chunky weight yarn or bulky weight yarn. I'm not sure the exact name, the exact title. It's yarn weight 5 though. And so this one moved quite a bit faster. Like I said, it's only about like 45 inches square in dimensions, and so it's not quite as big, and with the larger yarn it knits up quite a bit faster. I managed to get this one done in probably like a month or so. So yeah, like speed is definitely going to be impacted by yarn weight, but it's really about knowing what the project is for and who the project is for. So the final tip I have for y'all today has to do with blanket construction. And this is not like the other tips where it's going to depend heavily on what your particular purpose is or who this project is for. This is one area where I have like one specific piece of advice that I think everyone should be following. And that is your knit blankets should have as many seams as possible. So Knitting is very stretchy, and most of the time that's the reason that we love it so much. But with blankets, regardless of whether you're knitting a small blanket or a large blanket, they're all pretty objectively large and therefore are quite heavy. And stretchy and heavy don't mix well. It is a recipe for just a stretched out, distorted mess. And so adding seams to your blanket is a great way to add some reinforcement to keep everything looking nice and neat and not stretched out beyond all recognition. Now, I am in particular a fan of modular knitting, and so I've shown this blanket a couple times in this video so far, but let me show the other side. So modular knitting involves knitting a section, knitting one of these squares, and then picking up stitches along the edge of that square to start the next one. And so if you look on the wrong side of this thing, it just has seams all over the place, and that is exactly what a knit blanket needs because it's so heavy and so stretchy. And if it didn't have seams, then the force of gravity is just going to be pulling on those regular stitches, and like I said, they really want to stretch. But with the presence of seams, that gives something for gravity to pull against, without being able to actually distort the stitches themselves. But that being said, like maybe you've already got a pattern picked out and it's not a modular knit like this. There's still hope. Now, I mean, in a perfect world, I would go and find a pattern that had some substantial seams to make sure that my blanket is not going to stretch out more than it has to. But if you have your heart set on a pattern that doesn't have seams, there is something you can do after the fact to help prevent that like wild out of control stretch, and that is to add a border to your blanket. And a border can take a lot of different forms. So for example, on this blanket here that I have done an applied I-cord border. So I knit the body of the blanket, and then after the fact, I came back and knit this applied I-cord edge all along. And that is a really great thing to do because while the I-cord does have some stretch, it doesn't have as much stretch as the body of the blanket does. So once the I-cord hits that maximum stretch, it's not going to allow the surrounding stitches to stretch anymore as well. And so that is my go-to. I really love how clean and nice it looks. But that being said, another really common technique for people to do for knit blankets is to do a crochet border. So, and that is sort of like doubly useful because in addition to like having like the seam where the border starts along the body of the blanket, crochet itself just in general tends to be stiffer and less stretchy than knitting. So that's just another like level of non-stretch that's going to help prevent everything from getting distorted and stretched out in your blanket. And I actually have a tutorial myself for how to add an applied I-cord border to a piece of knitting. So I will link that in the description below if you want to go ahead and check that out if you need a border for your blanket. And so, like I said, this is one of those things where if you haven't picked out a blanket design, a specific blanket pattern yet, I would absolutely go for one that has as many seams as you can muster. But even if you already have your design picked out, you can always go back and add an I-cord border or add a crochet border or just any sort of seamed border is going to help provide some reinforcement and help provide something for gravity to pull on that aren't just like plain, like unsecured stitches. So I talked at the beginning of this process about the questions to keep in mind as you're making decisions about your blanket project. Who's it for? How big is it going to be? And what is the purpose of the blanket? And I just wanted to talk a little bit here at the end now about what to do when those questions, when those priorities are competing with one another. When, you know, one priority needs you to do this, but the other priority needs you to do this thing. How do you decide which priority is most important? And so I would say, at least in my personal opinion, the most important priority is going to be about the question, who is it for? And I think that's a very important question to prioritize because there are, at least in my life, a lot of people who are knit worthy, but who don't know or care about like different types of fiber and how they need to be treated. And so if this is a gift for someone else, 9 times out of 10, unless they are a fellow knitter or just a textile fiber enthusiast like me, I am going to make decisions that maximize the ease of care of the blanket. Now, when it comes to me personally, I am probably going to lean towards more maximizing, does it feel nice? You know, do I like the fibers? Are the fibers high quality? Those sorts of things. I'm willing to like be a little bit more fussy in terms of care of stuff like blankets. But once again, if this is for somebody else, if you're not knitting this for yourself, 9 times out of 10, it is going to serve you and your gift recipient best if you maximize the ease of care for the blanket. So go for the machine washable. Don't give them a giant California king size blanket. Make it something that a non-knitter, a non-fiber enthusiast can wrap their heads around and like do with relative ease. And while some of these are tricky questions to answer, it can be difficult to know what decision to make. I think, if at all possible, your best bet is to simply speak with the person that you're making the project for. Now, maybe you're not like me. Maybe you do surprise knits for people. I typically don't, spring hand knit gifts on people. I want to talk through the details. And I think that's your best bet, especially for a project that is going to be so big and so involved like a blanket, is that if at all possible, talk through these details, talk through these questions with your recipient so that you can get a really good idea of what they want and what they are hoping from this project. Alrighty, well, I think that is going to do it for the blanket tips today. If you made it this far, thanks for watching. I hope you got something useful out of this. If you have any questions about what I discussed in the video, be sure to leave those in the comments. Or if you'd like to see more knitting tip videos like this in the future, be sure to let me know in the comments as well. Like I mentioned at the beginning of the video, these tips are meant to be applied to any blanket pattern that you may encounter. But if you enjoyed the blanket that I showed off in the video, I am currently working on a pattern for this, so I would encourage you to subscribe to the channel so that you are notified as soon as that pattern is live and is available to download. But I think that's going to do it for today. I don't think I have anything else to mention, so I guess I will go ahead and end here and say bye, and I'll see y'all in the next one.